The stone font at St. Bride's had been cold since Candlemas, and Hester Vane, standing one pace behind the two nurses in the freezing side chapel of the church at Whitmore, watched the water shiver in it and understood that she was about to do something the law would call a crime. 2 infants lay in her arms. One wore the marchpane lace, 6 generations of it, yellowed at the cuff where a dead woman's fingers had worried it. The other wore linen the parish had provided, plain as a dishcloth, and belonged to a girl who had been carried out of the great house at midnight with a purse of £40 and instructions never to write. The vicar was still in the vestry. The godparents were still in the porch stamping the January cold out of their boots. There would be no second morning like this one. The nurse from the village said, Lady Adeline Marchpane, from the chapel doorway to nobody who required the information, "Bring the heir forward. Not that other creature. I cannot think why we permit it in the building." Hester did not lift her head. She had been called that other creature for 11 years, in one house and then another, and she had learned that a bowed head bought her another hour of employment. What Lady Adeline did not know, standing in her sable and her certainty at the chapel door, was that the woman she had just declined to name had spent the previous night not sleeping, but thinking, and had arrived at a conclusion that would take 23 years to finish arriving. She stepped forward to the font. She held out one child. The vicar was old and cold, and wanted his breakfast. That was the whole of the machinery Hester was relying on, and she had counted on it, the way an engineer counts on a beam. He came out of the vestry rubbing his hands. He did not look at the infants. Why would he look at the infants? Infants at a font are a species, not a person, and this one was wrapped in 6 generations of marchpane lace, and that was all, the identification any christening in Northumberland had ever required. The vicar came in, and the register was opened, and the water was blessed, and the name that was spoken over the infant in the marchpane lace was Edmund Charles Marchpane, heir to the barony of Whitmore and to 1,100 acres of Northumberland grazing. The child under that name had been born in a cottage at the edge of the estate, to a laundry-maid. At 2:30 in the morning, nobody in the chapel knew it but Hester. Nobody would know it for 23 years. If a story of a woman's slow patience is what brings you here in the evening, stay with it. This one takes its time on purpose. Hester had come to Whitmore House at 19 as nursery maid, and had risen to nurse by the ordinary means, which is to say that the woman above her had died of a bad winter, and nobody thought the position worth competing for. She was not pretty in the way the house measured prettiness. She was tall, and her hands were red to the wrist from carbolic and cold water, and she had a way of standing very still while people spoke about her as though she were furniture, which they took for stupidity and which was in fact a kind of listening. She had listened for 11 years. She knew which floorboard in the long gallery announced a visitor. She knew that Lord Whitmore read his letters twice and burned the second reading. She knew that Lady Adeline, his mother, had a lace fan. She raised exactly 1/2 inch. When she intended to say something, she would later deny having said. And she knew what had happened to Clara Ashby. Clara had been the laundry maid, 17 years old, with a laugh that carried up the back stairs and a habit of singing the wrong words to hymns. Robert Marchpane, the son of the house, had loved her. Not in the way the house assumed, which was carelessly and downward. He had loved her the way a young man loves once, badly and completely, and he had written to his mother from Lisbon, asking permission to marry her, and his mother had received that letter and read it twice and burned the second reading. What Lady Adeline had done next was neither cruel nor dramatic. By her own lights it was administrative. She had told Clara that Robert had been informed and had declined to answer. She had told Robert that Clara had taken £40 and gone to Newcastle with a corn factor. Each of them had believed her, because she was the sort of woman it did not occur to anyone to disbelieve, and because they were young, and because the alternative to believing her was to believe that the world was arranged against them, which at 19 is a difficult thing to credit. Hester had watched both of them stop being young. It happened to Clara in a laundry doorway in October, in the space of about 4 seconds, when Lady Adeline said the word Newcastle and the word factor and the girl's face did something that Hester never afterward managed to stop seeing. It happened to Robert in the courtyard in November, from a distance of 40 feet, with his horse already saddled, and it was quieter, and it was worse, because a man who has decided to feel nothing for 16 years makes that decision in about the length of time it takes to put on a glove. Clara went to the cottage at the edge of the estate. Robert went to a regiment. Hester had held both letters. She had been the one sent to fetch the sealing wax. The other child at the font that morning, the one in parish linen, was the son of Lady Widmore herself, the young wife Robert's elder brother had married in his haste to secure the line, and who had died 4 days after the birth without ever knowing what a nurse's arms felt like around her boy. His name in the register was written as Thomas Ashby, baseborn, parish charge, no acres, no lace, no future, beyond what a kitchen might offer him. Hester carried them both back to the house through snow that came to her ankle, one on each arm, and did not look at either of their faces. She was 19 years old when she fetched the sealing wax, and she had not known what the letter said. She had learned what it said 3 weeks later from the fire, because Lady Adeline burned things carelessly, and a folded sheet does not always burn, and Hester had knelt at a cold grate at 6 in the morning with a hearth brush in her hand and read a corner of a dead thing. She had told nobody. She was 19, and she had no character, and no family, and no place to go, and a nursery maid who accuses a dowager of anything at all is a nursery maid on the road, by dinner with no reference, and she knew that as certainly as she knew the shape of the back stairs. That was her wound, and she carried it for 23 years, and it was not a wound anybody could see. It was simply this. She had known a true thing, and she had been too small to make it matter, and she had never forgiven herself for the arithmetic that had turned out to be correct. She had told herself, in the night, that she was not seeking revenge. Revenge would have been a letter to the county, a word to a solicitor, a scandal. Revenge was loud, and loud things were dismantled by people with money. What she was doing was quieter than that, and slower, and it required only that she keep her mouth closed. For as long as it took, she kept it closed for 23 years. It is worth saying plainly what that cost, because the story will not say it again. It cost her every friendship she might have had in that village, because a woman with a secret cannot afford an intimate. It cost her the plain pleasure of being thought well of, because the only defense she ever had against Lady Adeline was silence, and silence in a great house is read as dullness. It cost her the chance to be young. She went into that chapel at 19, and came out of it a woman who could not afford to be careless again, and she was never careless again. Not once. Not for 23 years. And there is no register anywhere that records that. The boys grew up 1,100 yards apart. Edmund in the great house was a fine-boned, watchful child who could not be made to care about horses, and who was found at 7. In the linen press with a book of sermons, he could not possibly follow, reading it anyway, because it was there. Thomas in the cottage was broad by 9 and could carry a full pail in each hand, and had a laugh that carried in a way that made Hester have to sit down the first time she heard it. There is a particular labor in watching 2 boys grow up wearing each other's lives, and Hester performed it every day for 23 years without once being relieved of the shift. She washed the wrong child's face and called him by the right child's name. She let out the seams of a coat that had been cut for a body with different shoulders. When Edmund was 6 and cried because the pony would not love him, she held him and said nothing, because the only comfort she had was a sentence she could not say. When Thomas was 6 and split his lip on the pump handle, she happened to be walking that road with a basket she did not need. She happened to have clean linen in it, and she pressed it to his mouth and told him he was a brave boy, and walked away with her chest hollow before he could ask who she was. Twice a month she found a reason to go down to the village. A message for the blacksmith. A bolt of nursery flannel from the woman who kept the shop. Nobody questioned it, because a nurse who runs errands is a nurse being useful. and Lady Adeline had long since decided that Hester's movements were of no more interest than a broom's. She never once let herself into that cottage, without a reason she could have defended aloud. Clara raised him. Clara, who had grown thin and quiet, who took in washing for the village and did it badly at first, and then very well, who never remarried, never explained herself. She believed the boy in her arms was hers. Hester had made certain of that, and it was the part of the arrangement that cost her most, and she never once permitted herself to consider it in daylight. Robert did not come home. He was reported at Corunna, and then not reported. And then, in 1814, a letter arrived saying he had been in a French prison for 6 years and was walking slowly in the direction of the coast. He arrived in the spring of 1815. He was 34 years old and looked 50, and his elder brother had been dead 2 years, and he was Lord Whitmore now, and he had a nephew of 9 to raise. "You will find him improved," his mother said in the hall, with her fan at a measured height. "The nurse has been adequate. She is a plain creature and not clever, which in a nursery is a mercy." Robert looked past his mother to the woman on the stairs, with a child's coat over her arm. He looked at her for 4 full seconds, which in that house was an eternity, and then he said nothing at all. Hester went up the stairs with her face burning and told herself it was the cold. He was not the young man who had left. That young man had been quick and loud and easily wounded. What came back from Verdun was a stillness. A man who sat at the head of his own table and did not speak for whole courses. Who rode out at dawn alone and returned at dusk alone, whose face, as the housekeeper put it, was ice over a river. The staff were frightened of him. The village was frightened of him. Hester, who had spent 11 years reading the small movements of a family that considered her blind, was not frightened of him. And this was, she thought later, the beginning of everything. The house did not know what to do with him. Caro, the housekeeper, who had been at Whitmore 30 years and had buried 2 masters, took to keeping the study fire banked all night because he sat in it, and nobody had the courage to ask him whether he wished to be warm. The footman learned to set his plate down without speaking. Lady Adeline at dinner filled the silence the way she filled every silence, with the names of families and the arrangements between them, and her son ate very little and answered in single syllables and did not once look at the empty chair at the far end where his brother had sat. Hester watched all of it from the doorway with a child's coat over her arm, which was where a nurse stood, and she catalogued it the way she catalogued everything. He did not sleep. She knew, because the nursery was over the study, and she heard the chair move at 2 and at 4. He did not drink, which surprised her. He read his letters twice, and did not burn the second reading, which surprised her more, and told her something about what 16 years does to a man's opinion of his own mother's post. He came into the nursery on his 3rd night home. 9 o'clock, no candle in his hand and his shirt sleeves like a man who had forgotten what he was. "Sit down," he said. She had been standing. She sat. "He does not ride," Robert said, looking at the sleeping boy. "No, my lord. My brother rode before he could walk." "Yes, my lord." He was quiet a long while. The fire settled. Hester found that she was aware of exactly where he stood in the room without looking, and that her pulse had moved into her throat, and she disliked both facts extremely. "Does he read?" "Everything he can reach." "And several things he cannot." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was the memory of one arriving late. He crossed to the window. The boy slept on. Somewhere below a door closed and a woman's voice, his mother's, gave an instruction to somebody about the morning. "My mother will want him put on a horse," he said. "Yes, my lord. She will want it a great deal. Yes, my lord." He looked at Hester then, properly, for the first time since the hall. She was 38 years old, with red hands and her cap crooked from a day of it, and she made herself look back at him because looking away would have been an answer of a different kind. "Then let him alone," Robert said, and left. She sat in the dark nursery for an hour afterward without moving, and told herself that she had been given an instruction about a child, and nothing else, and that a woman of 38 with red hands and no family did not require anything else. There is a moment, in every long silence, when the person keeping it begins to want to be found out. Hester's arrived that spring. The occasion was small. A tenant's daughter, Nan Peveril, 12 years old and sharp as a tack, had been caught with a marchpane silver spoon in her apron and was to be given to the magistrate, and Lady Adeline had made this decision in the morning room with 2 callers present and her fan at a half-inch. The girl was in the hall when Hester came down, held at the elbow by a footman who plainly wished he were elsewhere. And she was not crying. That was the thing Hester noticed. 12 years old, with her father's rent 3/4 behind and a mother coughing in a cottage with a wet wall. And Nan stood in the marble hall of Whitmore House with a stolen spoon on the table in front of her, and her jaw set like a woman of 40. Lady Adeline was explaining the necessity of it to her callers. She was not angry. That was the worst of it. She spoke of the girl the way one speaks of a gate that will not latch, with a mild regret that the thing must be dealt with, and her 2 callers made the small, sympathetic noises that the county made when Lady Adeline was being reasonable. Hester came down and said the spoon was hers and that she had given it to the child, and that if the magistrate wanted it, he might have it from her hand. It was a lie, and a bad one, and it cost her a quarter's wages and a public reprimand delivered in the hall in front of the footman. She is a servant, with pretensions, Lady Adeline told Mrs. Exteme. Carol, the housekeeper, in a voice pitched to travel, "That other creature. One gives them a nursery, and they imagine they have been given a conscience." Hester stood through it with her hands folded and her head down. That was the second time. What she did not know was that Robert had been on the gallery landing with a book he was not reading, and had seen the whole of it, from the girl's shaking hands to the spoon to the moment Hester lied for her, and did it badly, and did not care. He did not come down. He went to his study and sat for a long time, with his hand at his breast pocket. In April, a fever went through the village, and Hester went into it. She had not been asked. Nobody asks a nurse. A nurse is a woman with linen and no rank, and the village had spent 11 years deciding she was the great house's creature, and the great house had spent 11 years deciding she was the village's leavings, and the arrangement suited everybody except her. She went with vinegar and clean linen and a stubbornness that the village found alarming, and she sat up 4 nights in the Peveril cottage and 2 in another. And on the 5th night she came up the drive at 3 in the morning and found Lord Whitmore on the steps of his own house with a lantern, waiting. "Come inside," he said. "I am not fit to. There is fever in the village, my lord, and I have been sitting in it. Come inside." She came inside. He put her in a chair in his study, which no servant had ever sat in, and he gave her wine she did not drink, and he stood at the window, with his back to her for a quarter of an hour, and did not say one word. The study was the warmest room in the house, and she had never been inside it. She sat on the edge of the chair because, sitting back in, it seemed a liberty, and she was aware of the mud drying on her hem, and of the wine going untouched at her elbow, and of the fact that she had not eaten since Tuesday. The clock on the chimney-piece was French, and had a shepherdess on it. She looked at the shepherdess for a long time, because looking at the shepherdess was easier than looking at the window. Her hands were shaking, which was the fever cottages and the cold and 4 nights without sleep, and it was not only that, and she knew it was not only that. She understood that she was being kept warm. She understood it in her body before she permitted it in her mind, which is the way that sort of understanding tends to arrive, and she looked at the shape of his shoulders against the black glass and thought, quite clearly and quite hopelessly, that she had loved this man for 9 weeks and I did not notice. "There was a girl," he said to the window. Hester's hands went still in her lap. "Before Spain, she sang hymns wrongly on purpose because she liked to be corrected." He did not turn around. "I wrote to my mother from Lisbon to ask if I might marry her. My mother wrote that the girl had taken money and gone north with a corn factor. I believed it for 16 years. I believed it in a French prison, which is a place where a man has a great deal of time to believe things." He drew from his breast pocket a small thing, and set it on the desk without looking at it. A ribbon, faded from blue to almost nothing, 3 inches long. The sort of thing a laundry maid ties in her hair on a Sunday. I half kept this because I could not decide whether it was hers or my own foolishness, he said. Both, I expect. Then he said in the same level voice, Go to bed, Miss Vane. She went. She lay in the dark with her heart going like a hammer, and the truth sitting on her chest with all its weight, because she knew exactly where Clara was, and had known for 23 years, and had said nothing, and every hour she went on saying, nothing was an hour of that man's life she was spending on his mother's behalf. She said nothing for 11 more days. Then she made a decision that was not quiet at all. The occasion was the Whitmore summer ball, the first the house had given in a decade, and it was Lady Ottilie's project entire. 90 candles in the long room, the marchpane played out, an orchestra from Newcastle, and Miss Georgiana Frail, 22, seated at the dowager's right hand, in ice-blue silk, a young woman who had been told from the age of 6 that she was the correct choice, and who had, to her credit, never once doubted it, because nobody had ever given her a reason to. Hester was there, because Edmund, now 23, and Lord Whitmore's heir presumptive, had asked her to be, not the child now. A tall, watchful young man with a book habit and no seat on a horse, who had asked his old nurse to stand at the back of the room because he found ballrooms unbearable, and she was the only person in the house who had ever let him alone. She wore gray. It was her best. It had been her best for 6 years. Around her the county assembled itself. 90 candles doubled themselves in the long mirrors and doubled again in the terrace glass, so that the room seemed to run on past its own walls into a gold country with no edges. There were diamonds at throats that had worn diamonds for 4 generations. There was a Newcastle orchestra playing quadrilles at a tempo the Newcastle orchestra plainly considered beneath it. There was the smell of hot wax and hothouse roses and 200 people in July. And there was Hester by the terrace doors in a gray gown with a mended cuff, standing very still with her hands folded, watching. Miss Frail danced twice, and sat down at the dowager's right hand, and arranged her fan in her lap exactly as she had been taught, and she was lovely, and she was not stupid, and she had spent the evening waiting for a man to cross a room to her, because that was what the last 22 years had promised her would happen. Lord Whitmore did not cross the room to her. He stood at the head of it with his hands behind his back and did not dance at all. And twice in the space of an hour his eyes went to the terrace doors, and each time they came back to the room a half-second late. The dowager's fan came up 1/2 inch. The room was gold, and the room was loud, and Hester stood by the terrace doors with her hands folded, and watched the machinery of a county work itself, and at 10 o'clock Lady Ottilie crossed to Miss Frail, with her fan up, and said in a voice calibrated to carry as far as the terrace doors and no further, "Do not distress yourself, my dear. He looks at her the way one looks at an old coat. That other creature has been in this house since before you were born. She is scenery." Miss Frail laughed, because a young woman laughs when a dowager makes a joke, and because she had not yet learned to hear the difference between a joke and a knife. That was the 3rd time. Hester felt it go in. She had been called it in a chapel and in a hall, and now in a ballroom in front of 90 candles and 200 people, and she found, to her own surprise, that she was not humiliated. She was finished. She left the ball. She walked 1,100 yards in slippers, through wet grass, to a cottage with one window lit. The grass was to her ankle and wet through, and the slippers were ruined inside 100 yards, and she took them off and went the rest of the way barefoot with them in her hand, like a girl, which she had not been for 19 years. The music followed her a long distance. It thinned, and then it was one violin, and then it was nothing but sheep and her own breathing. 1,100 yards. She had walked it perhaps 600 times in 23 years, and every one of those times she had turned back at the gate with her mouth shut. She knew the gate. She knew the give in the latch and the place where the top bar had been mended with wire in the year the old queen was ill, She had put her hand on that wire 600 times and taken it off again. Clara was 40 years old and looked it, and she was mending a shirt by a rushlight, and she looked up when the door opened and saw a tall woman in gray, soaked to the knee, and said, "Hester, is it the boy?" "Sit down," Hester said, and heard whose words they were and did not care. "Clara, he wrote to you." The shirt came down slowly into Clara's lap. "From Lisbon. Before Corunna. He asked his mother if he might marry you." She read it, and she burned it, and she told you he had declined to answer, and she told him you had taken £40 and gone to Newcastle with a corn factor. I fetched the wax she sealed it with. I have known for 23 years. The rushlight hissed. Somewhere out in the dark, a sheep complained. "Why?" Clara said. Not a question. The words simply came out and lay there. "Because I was 19 and I was afraid. And because by the time I was not afraid, it was too late to be believed, and because I had done something instead of telling, and I thought the something would be enough." Hester's voice did not shake. Her hands did. "It was not enough. I am telling you now, and I will tell him tonight, and I will be turned out by morning, and that is correct. And I am not asking you for anything." Clara stood up. The shirt fell on the floor. 23 years, she said. "Yes. You held my son." "Yes." Clara crossed the room and stopped an arm's length away. And Hester made herself stand still for whatever came. And what came was Clara's hand on her wrist, and Clara's face doing something terrible and complicated, and Clara saying, very low, "Then you will hold him again in front of them. Tonight. All of it. Or I will." They walked back through the wet grass together. The long room was still going at midnight. Hester came in through the terrace doors with the mud to her knee and a laundress at her shoulder, and the orchestra did not stop, because orchestras do not, but the first 6 people who saw them stopped, and then 30 did, and then the music went ragged and died in the middle of a phrase. Lady Adeline rose. Her fan was at a half-inch and climbing. "Remove them," she said. Nobody moved. The footman did not move, because Mrs. Caro at the door had put one hand flat against the paneling, which in that house was a signal older than any of them. Robert came through the crowd. He stopped in front of Hester and looked past her, and saw a thin woman of 40 in a mended shawl with gray coming in at her temple and her chin up. And Hester watched the ice go off him, all at once, the whole architecture of 16 years, and it was not a pleasant thing to see. It was like watching a wall come down. "Clara," he said, "Robert." He turned to his mother. 200 people were watching. He did not raise his voice at all. "Mother, did you burn my letter?" The fan came down. Lady Adeline's mouth opened and shut. She said, "Robert?" Then she said, "It was not." Then she said, "You cannot ask me that here," which was the closest thing to a confession the county had ever heard from her. And the county heard it. Hester stepped forward and said the rest, plainly in a voice that carried to the back of the room, the letter, the wax, the £40, the corn factor, the cottage, the date. And then, because she had come this far and there was no country beyond it, she said the last thing. "And the boy christened Edmund Charles Marchpane at St. Bride's in January of 1792 is Clara's son. And the man you know as Thomas Ashby, who shoes your horses, is your brother's son, and the heir to this house. I carried them both to the font. I gave the vicar the wrong child on purpose. It was my hand and my choice and nobody else's, and I have never been sorry, and I am prepared to be hanged for it." The silence in that room had a floor to it. Edmund Marchpane put down his glass. He was 23, and he had never once wanted the acres, and everybody in the county knew it, and he crossed to Hester and stood beside her, which was the only answer he ever gave. Robert crossed the room in 3 strides. He did not go to his mother. He did not go to Miss Frail, who had stood up with her hands pressed together and her face gone white with the simple shock of a script failing. He stopped in front of Hester, and he took her red hand in both of his, and in front of 200 people, 90 candles, and his own mother, he said it. "This woman gave me back my life. I will marry her 9 words." He said nothing else. The room made a sound that was not applause and not a gasp, and could not afterward be described by anyone who was in it. Nan, 25, and standing at the back with the other tenants' daughters who had been permitted in to see the candles, put both hands over her mouth. Mrs. Carrow took her hand off the paneling. Thomas, who had come up from the yard because his mother had walked out into the dark and had not come back, stood in the terrace doorway in his working shirt with his arms hanging and understood approximately 1/3 of what he had heard, and looked at Clara, and did not move, and would not move for a quarter of an hour. And Miss Frail, who had been told she was the correct choice since she was 6, sat back down slowly and discovered, in one clean moment, that she was not, and that the world had gone on being the world regardless, and that she was going to have to find out who she was without the assistance of a dowager. She was, in the end, the only person in that room who got a whole life out of the evening. Lady Adeline sat down, not gracefully. She sat down because her knees went, and her fan lay in her lap unopened, and old Lady Rushmere, who had known her 40 years and had never liked her, said quite audibly, "Oh, Adeline," in the voice one uses at a graveside, and that was the whole of her punishment, and it was sufficient. She left Whitmore in September for a house in Bath. She was not cast out. She was simply, from that night, a woman whose word carried nothing, in a county where a word was the only currency she had ever held. Mr. Sowerby, the solicitor, was in the room as it happened, at the far end by the card tables because Lady Adeline had invited him to give the evening wait. He came forward with his glass still in his hand and asked, in the flat way of his profession, whether the nurse would swear it before a magistrate. "Yes," said Hester. "Then it is a matter of the register and 2 living witnesses," he said, "and Mrs. Ashby is one, and the vicar's book is the other. And I would advise nobody in this room to speak of hanging. It took 14 months, and it was tedious, and Hester gave evidence 4 times, twice at Newcastle and twice at Whitmore, and the last time she gave at Mr. Reedmore. Sowerby had to ask her to speak up because her voice had gone, and Lord Whitmore stood up at the back of the room until it was noticed that he was standing, and then everybody found that they could hear her perfectly well. Nobody was hanged. Mr. Sowerby had been right about that. A magistrate faced with a nurse of 41, a laundress, a vicar's book, a farrier who did not want a barony, and a baron who did want the nurse, and the whole county watching to see what he would do with them, discovered in himself a great enthusiasm for the view that a christening register may be corrected without anyone being ruined by it. It took 14 months. Thomas, who had been a farrier for 9 years and had shoulders like a door, was recognized as heir presumptive to Whitmore, and did not want it either, at first, and then discovered that he did, because his mother wanted a name for him and he found he could not refuse her that. He kept the forge. He is the only baron in Northumberland who shoes his own horses, and the county has decided to find this charming, which is what a county does when a thing cannot be undone. Edmund kept his books. He took a living at Whitmore Parish when the old vicar died, and married Nan, who was 25 by then, and had never once forgotten who had lied for her over a silver spoon, and they had 4 children, and no acres, and no lace. Robert and Hester were married in November, at St. Bride's, at the same font by Edmund, with 11 people present. She wore grey. It was still her best, and she had discovered she did not mind. Clara stood up with her. There had been no discussion about it. Thomas gave the bride away and did it badly, being unaccustomed, and put her hand into his uncle's with the care of a man setting a shoe. And the 11 people present all pretended not to notice that the bride's hands were shaking, which was the kindest thing that county ever did for anybody. There was no wedding journey. There was a fire in the small parlor at Whitmore, and snow starting outside the window at 4 in the afternoon, and Clara in the chair opposite with her feet on the fender because Hester had made her put them there, and Thomas somewhere below in the yard, doing something to a hinge that did not need doing. The parlor was small, and the fire was too big for it, which was Thomas's doing, because a farrier's notion of a fire is not a lady's notion of a fire, and nobody in that house had the heart to correct him. Clara had her mending. Clara would always have her mending. She had been offered a room at Whitmore and had taken it, and had also, within a fortnight, quietly resumed taking in washing for 3 families in the village, who could not afford to lose her. And when her son, the Baron, objected, she looked at him over her spectacles until he stopped. Hester sat with her hands open in her lap. They were still red. They would always be red. Her husband came in with the cold on his coat and stood behind her chair, and after a moment he reached over her shoulder and put something down on the small table by the fire, where the light could reach it. 3 inches of ribbon faded from blue to almost nothing. It was hers, Hester said. It was mine, he said. I am giving it to you. Outside the window, the snow came down over 1,100 acres, and over a forge, and over a parish church, and over a font that had been cold since Candlemas and was cold still, and had witnessed the only crime Hester ever committed, and had kept it and had given it back. She did not say anything. She put her hand over the ribbon and left it there. Thank you for staying until the end.